I have visited the ISI in Kolkata in the year 2010 for a nice occasion, but I had not been to Delhi or to this establishment prior to this visit, and I've been enjoying it very much. Now, there are three major figures that I associate with statistics in India. P.C. Mahalanobis, of course, is one. C.R. Rao is another. And the third that I'll mention is Raj Bahadur. Now, I believe I only saw Mahalanobis once at a meeting at a distance, and I was impressed by the large crowd that he drew wherever he went, but I never got a chance to meet him. I have known C.R. Rao for many years and enjoyed the experience very much, had many interesting discussions with him at various meetings. But Raj Bahadur was my colleague for many years at the University of Chicago. He was a close friend and someone whose judgment and knowledge I learned could be trusted completely. We still celebrate him annually with a series called the Bahadur Lectures. Now, I know many other people in Indian statistics personally here and in Calcutta and in other universities in the US, but those three stand out. Now, they played very different but overlapping roles in the 20th century of science and statistics. Mahalanobis, who we're celebrating here this year, played a key role, maybe the key role. Without him, the others would no doubt have had illustrious careers, but they would have been different careers. He was the one who created the institution that brought them along and led to their eminence. Mahalanobis' early career was remarkable in that little he encountered in the 5 years after he entered Presidency College gave any hint as to what was to come. You cannot look at his experiences there and make any sensible prediction. He passed science, he achieved honors in physics in 1912, and then he went to England, and if you believe the accounts, by chance alone, he ended up at Cambridge. And there he spent 2 years before returning to Calcutta. And the only hint that I could find in the story of those early years is the story that on the ship on the way back to India from England, he read through entirely all of the first 9 volumes of Biometrica, which were the only ones that had been published to that time. He bought the set and read them on the ship. Now, I would have picked some novels or something else, but you can see there's a certain drive that this demonstrates. There still is nothing in the record to foreshadow the great things that he did. The major accomplishments most associated with him are these. His remarkable work in economic planning, including the second 5-year plan under Nehru, his work in sampling and multivariate analysis, and his achievements as an institution builder, particularly with the Indian Statistical Institute. Now, there are surely others, even in this room, who would be better placed than I to tell stories about his work and his excellence in all of these areas. And no doubt they will over the course of this year of celebration. But my plan is much more limited. I want to tell 3 stories that are not so well known, 3 stories that catch a part of his background and a part of his personality and help reveal the roots of his extraordinary success. These involve, number 1, his second publication of 1922-23, finished in 1 year, published in the next. Number 2, how his relationship with Fisher almost came to an unfortunate early end. And number 3, how he engineered a remarkable feat in 1938, which put Indian statistics on a track to the global influence that it exerts to this present day. Those 3 are my goals, and we'll return to them again at the end. But first, 1922-23. I should be running this too. There's just rehearsing some of the things that I've been saying. And the major areas that you can see as to what he was working, and the three parts that I will be discussing. So we go to his second published paper with an improbable and mysterious title, On the Seat of Activity in the Upper Air. How many of you can guess what that would be about? Well, in order to dispel that mystery, I have to go to a little bit of background, specifically on British meteorology between 1910 and 1920. The major figure in that field was a gentleman named William Henry Dines. His picture is in the lower right there. A formidable look to his face, and I suspect it accurately depicted his personality. He was a Cambridge graduate who combined, according to one account, the practical skill of an engineer with the precision of thought of a mathematician. He was independently wealthy, and after he got his degree, he dedicated his life to research which he could finance himself. Now, what did he accomplish? Well, before Dines, meteorology was earthbound, an earthbound field. You stood on the earth and you measured the weather. After Dines, well, he elevated it. He elevated it to the upper atmosphere, partly through the invention of a device that could measure wind and atmospheric pressure and temperature continuously from the ground to the stratosphere. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1905. Now, Dines' device was a very clever thing. It would measure these variables in a continuous way and engrave them on a metal tube. The question was how to get it into the upper atmosphere. Well, he'd attach it to a balloon. I'll show you a picture here. That's what one of the balloons would look like. And the device would be held in a cage that would be suspended below the balloon. And the balloon would be set out and it would start recording as soon as you released it, a hydrogen-filled balloon. As it climbed up to the stratosphere, the atmospheric pressure would drop and the balloon would expand until it got usually up to the stratosphere, 10 kilometers above Earth, and then it would explode, and it would then descend to the Earth with enough of a chute to break the speed, and then you would recover this drum, and you would then read from it the meteorology of this ascent, having registered it both going up and coming down. Now, this would be done hundreds of times. This is not something you do once. You do it hundreds of times in different places. And usually you had to recover it in order to make this work. And so it turns out that the inland trials were much more successful than those on the coast. If the wind was blowing to the sea, well, anyway, lost experiment. But it led to a true meteorology of the upper air, and it gave you a whole new look on what was going on. Now, the war slowed this research. After 1912, they were sending other things into the air. But in 1919, Dines was able to write a full account that made use of his earlier experiments. And among his many skills was he was really good at Pearsonian statistics up to a point. And he knew about partial correlation and partial regression coefficients and all sorts of stuff like that. And one of his conclusions that had already been reached in 1912 stands out. And I'm going to read one version of that from one of his publications there. You don't have to be able to read this. I will read it. Just one short sentence. It is the value of the air pressure at about 9 kilometers height which it regulates the position of the boundary. Now, loosely translated, what he means to say there, and what he says in an extended discussion, is that the pressure, the barometric pressure at the height of 9 kilometers, which is the base of the stratosphere, controlled, and that is caused in modern terminology, a whole collection of meteorological variables, including pressure at the lower levels and mean temperatures too. In order to make meteorological predictions then, all you needed was that one quantity, the pressure at 9 kilometers. This was the seat of activity. Now Mahalanobis came upon all of this. He was urged to look at it by a friend in India. And this is what he's saying, on the seat of activity, the seat, the cause of the basic point that you have to look at, the one that explains everything in meteorology in the upper air. And basically what he found was that, what Dines had found, how would he come to this conclusion? The correlations of several variables were much higher when correlated with the 9-kilometer pressure than any others. So if you're using correlation as a stand-in for causation, and this is causal inference in 1912, then the high correlations will point to the 9-kilometer level as the controlling variable, the cause. Now Mahalanobis' main point was that Dines' calculations neglected the very high serial correlation in this sequence of measurements that were taken in one ascent and one descent. Taking those into account, here's some more parts of Mahalanobis' paper. It's really a beautifully written paper, by the way. He's explaining what these different, what the basic issues are. He's looking at trying to explain how the correlation coefficient comes into this. He's explaining what are the different problems you have in measuring things, how you have to pay attention to this, that, and the other thing. And he ends up saying, and the top line there is the one that is really taking, that what Mahalanobis finds is that taking the proper way of viewing the correlations into account, that the highest correlation was at a much lower atmospheric level than 9 kilometers. In fact, it was between 2 and 4 kilometers, and it was not nearly as high as that at the extremes, at the stratosphere had been claimed was. Now, this was what he's doing here is he's taking on the leading figure in British meteorology. He's taking him on his own grounds, and he's saying, you neglected something. If you do it correctly, you get an entirely different answer, and therefore you should rethink what you're doing. And that's a very bold thing for a young man to say to a fellow of the Royal Society who is, in fact, almost in control of the whole enterprise. Well, in the May 1923 issue of Nature, there was a review of Mahalanobis' paper, unsigned review. That's the whole thing there. You don't have to read it. But he has a few nasty things to say. It's come to the conclusion that the corrections of... But he, Mahalanobis, has fallen into error, blah, blah, blah. Now, there's only one person who could have written this review, and that's Dines. It's clear. I don't know any evidence, just I read it, and he's the only one who knew Dines' work that well. And so what happens? Mahalanobis writes to Nature, and they publish, and he writes a very measured, a very elegant discussion, not being audacious, just Presidency College, Calcutta. He just saying that, no, I think I'm right, and you may have made a few minor corrections to what I was saying, but I frankly don't think that made any difference, and the real issue is one that you didn't address at all in that thing, and this is, it's all correct, and why don't we send it to Carl Pearson for adjudication? And Dines, or the writer of the first note, replied and avoided all these questions and didn't say very much. He said, well, we'll wait and see. Humph, he says. Now this is a a major claim by a leader in the field, and this is a beautiful work of Mahalanobis's, which uses physics, it uses statistics, it uses rhetoric, it uses analysis, it uses logic. It is a gorgeous piece of work for any scientist, but for one who's just beginning a writing career, it's an unusually good performance. That's one of the points I want to make. There's another one that I will make a bit later. So let's go see what we can learn here. As I say, statistically, Mahalanobis was certainly correct. And the other thing I mention here now is that the subject was in fact causal inference, a modern hot topic in statistics. On to 1930. Mahalanobis and Fisher. That's a picture was not taken in 1930. That's more like the 1950s, but it shows the two of them together. They may have crossed paths without meeting in Cambridge in 1913. I don't know. They were there at about the same time, but not in any long period. They had some correspondence in the mid-1920s. Mahalanobis had become aware of Fisher's increasing visibility in his work in statistics, his design of experiments, his planning of experiments, his analysis, his textbook. But he hadn't really had much to do, they hadn't had much to do with one another until the late 1920s, till the final months of 1929 and the early months of 1930. And the story I want to tell is about those months. And it will be told through some correspondence, which I'm going to read selections to, and I'll put up the letters as I go through, but do not feel you have to read them. In fact, I recommend not, but just to give you a flavor of authenticity, these letters were all kept by Fisher and were not among those that were published in the works that have been, the letters that have been published by Fisher. Or of Fisher's correspondence with people, including Mahalanobis. In November of 1929, Mahalanobis wrote to Fisher that he, Mahalanobis, had submitted 2 articles to Biometrica, and Carl Pearson had rejected them both without serious comment. And the articles were something that we could recognize now. One of them was a long statistical thing that you could now see was leading to d squared, the Mahalanobis distance, and it had departed from Pearson's own method of approaching the problem, which Mahalanobis argued was not the right way to do it. Again, that's a bold thing to be doing. And Mahalanobis must have known about Fisher's critical interactions with Fisher and Pearson's lack of regard for one another, because in November of 1929, he'd written to Fisher, and Fisher wrote back, and that's where I find out what he'd asked Fisher about. He'd written to Fisher complaining that he'd been dealt with harshly by Biometrica. Fisher could agree with that. He thought any young man who told him that had to be telling the truth, because that's the way Biometrica was run. And Fisher writes back, "I'm very glad to hear from you, as the progress of your work has interested me greatly. Your experience of Professor Pearson is, I am afraid, typical. I am not directly connected with ethnography, though the subject interests me greatly. I have, therefore, consulted Mr. Udny Yule, and at his suggestion am sending your papers to the Royal Anthropological Institute, and my suggestion and Yule's support, with my suggestion and Yule's support for publication. I hope the Institute will accept them for publication, but of this I cannot be sure. Yours sincerely, R.A. Fisher." January 8th, Mahalanobis replies, "Dear Dr. Fisher, I'm very grateful." Mahalanobis knew that he'd get a response probably like this. "For the interest you're taking in my work. I was naturally feeling a little depressed after Professor Pearson's curt refusal, but your letter is giving me great encouragement." And he goes on to say that if the Royal Anthropological Institute declined, Metron would be a possibility, and he asked if Fisher would send him a formal endorsement such as he might send to that journal. Fisher, 1930, January 27th, writes, "Dear Professor Mahalanobis," he sent the letter of endorsement, and he also wrote, "I have no hesitation in recommending for publication your valuable study of measures of racial likeness. I hope the Royal Anthropological Institute may publish it, although I have not heard yet. Mr. Udney Yule agrees with me entirely as to its value. Metron would make a quite suitable medium, but I believe the ease with which publications are accepted depends sometimes on the state of its funds, and I have no recent information as to how they stand. Yours sincerely. On the 6th of March, Mahalanobis writes, I am extremely grateful to you for sending your letter of a recommendation. I shall use it only in the case of the Anthropological Institute in case they are unable to publish it. Yours sincerely. But a storm soon came into view. Fisher quickly heard from the Institute that they would not publish. And he wrote back and asked, why? And on the 27th of March, Fisher received the surprising reply. On the left there. Dear Sir, with reference to your letter of 13th ultimate, that the two papers by Professor Mahalanobis, and the two papers by Professor Mahalanobis, I have to inform you that the Executive Committee adheres to its decision. The committee understands that part of the papers is being published in Biometrica. What? Yours faithfully. Now you must understand this about Fisher. Fisher had a short temper, and he must have thought he was being played for a fool. He often made quick and permanent judgments about people, and he was not noted for being forgiving. The next day, Fisher wrote curtly to Mahalanobis, Dear Mahalanobis, you know there's no Professor Mahalanobis, it's Dear Mahalanobis. After a prolonged correspondence, I have just received a letter of which the enclosed is a copy. Of course, if the committee had any grounds for thinking that you had come to an agreement with the editor of Biometrica, their action is comprehensible. I shall, however, in any case, be glad to know where the papers are published. Yours sincerely. He was clearly washing his hands of the operation here. Probably permanently. But what had happened? Well, next letter. Mahalanobis on the 23rd of April, which is that's not quite a month after the previous letter, but these are traveling from England to India. He sent Fisher a 5-page detailed letter with a great deal of explanation and a bit of apology. Dear Dr. Fisher, I have just received your letter of the 28th of March. I am extremely grateful to you for taking so much trouble on my behalf. This makes me all the more anxious to remove the misunderstanding which appears to have arisen in connection with the publication of a portion of my paper in Biometrica. I hope you will excuse my writing in some detail. He basically lays his soul bare. He's going to tell the whole story now, which he had not done yet. I think it's in one of C.R. Rao's memorial statements about Mahalanobis that he has the cryptic statement that said, Mahalanobis did not always put all of his cards on the table. His explanation was extensive and detailed. He explained that he had sent 2 papers to Biometrica, but not at the same time. The most extensive was one that he referred to as Tests and Measures of Divergence, which he'd sent in March 1929, and the other a bit later. The later one was a comparison of measures in regard to some Swedish anthropological data using the measure of racial difference. Pearson had summarily rejected the first, and a bit later his assistant Morant had written more encouragingly about the second, but not accepting it, with the suggestion that an abridged version cut down to the anthropological material, throw out the statistics, we'll just publish the data, might be publishable, and offering to do the cutting. Mahalanobis agreed, but a long silence then followed, and he heard nothing for several months. And in late November 1929, when he'd written to Fisher, he had not heard. Then on the 19th of February, he finally received a letter from Morant, Pearson's assistant, apologizing for the delay, but saying he'd heard the paper was submitted to the Anthropological Institute, so it would hardly do to publish in Biometrica. Mahalanobis agreed, explaining the steps Fisher had taken, and said he would not publish in Biometrica unless the Anthropological Institute turned him down. He explained that he had finally received the letter from the Institute rejecting this paper, and he granted Morant permission to go ahead with an abbreviated version of the second paper. And he wrote to Fisher, "I realize I ought to have cleared up the situation with regard to Biometrica before sending you my papers. I hope you will forgive me for the muddle caused by my oversight." Fisher replied on the 12th of May, clearly annoyed, even though he accepted the explanation, at least, and he wrote that he accepted it, and suggested that Mahalanobis should communicate directly with any journal, effectively declining to play any sponsoring role. And he wrote, "Had I been able to explain your exact position vis-a-vis Biometrica, I would have avoided the misapprehension under which I have no doubt they acted in refereeing your paper." But as we shall see, in the end, Mahalanobis succeeded in fully restoring good relations with Fisher. The relationship was long-standing. Both papers did get published in rewritten versions. The first and most consequential was published by the Journal of the Asiatic Society of Bengal, and the version of the other one was drastically edited, and I'll say some more about that later, and published, edited by Morant and published in Biometrica. So here we have PMC surviving. It's the only case I know of this kind of survival, and a troublesome interaction with Fisher, and making the most out of it to a very high degree, because he went on over the next couple of years with what is evident from the exterior, but as far as I know, never publicly explained, with a grand plan, and Fisher was to play a major role in that plan. So I go to part 3, the events of 1938. Now, 2 pieces of background here. Let's see how we're doing. I take it as either known or knowable, or I will remind you that Mahalanobis established both the ISI and Sankhya over a 2-year span. It was, if you look at the first report on the ISI and at the first issue of Sankhya in 1933, it's hard to see that anything big is coming down the tracks, frankly. To the outside appearance, the ISI was just another professional society with a journal. And as its early sessions were mostly talks presented by Mahalanobis, the secretary of the Institute, that doesn't seem like such a big deal. Now you contrast that with the 6th report coming a few years later, 5 years after the second, and the ISI was by then a very different organization, clearly recognizable as an ancestor of the current institute. The first Indian Statistical Conference was held in January 1938, with the Viceroy in attendance and with R.A. Fisher as the conference president. The phenomenal development between those and over that 5-year period was no accident. It can only be seen as evidence that without public announcement, Mahalanobis had fulfilled his first 5-year plan. He went from starting a society, which meant that a few people were going to exchange letters, basically, to a major institution and a Congress, a full-fledged Congress, held with the international star as the announced president, Ronald Fisher. And it was just a tremendous growth in terms of institution building. Now, the preparations for that month of January 1938 were extensive. He involved many cities, and Fisher's visit was meticulously planned. a sum of around 4,000 rupees. I take that to be a fairly large sum at that time. Was available for Fisher's visit alone. It was part of the condition that brought Fisher over for this. There were two focal points for it. One was the 3-day conference from January 7th to 9th, and the second was a series of 6 lectures that Fisher gave at Presidency College in Calcutta, at the University of Calcutta. Now, Fisher's visit he was the most famous living statistician at that point. He arrived in Bombay. He was here for a month and a half. He arrived in Bombay on the 17th of December. He was here to the end of January. He visited 10 cities. He gave at least 15 lectures, and they were different topics. Almost all of them were different topics. From the 1st to the 17th of January, he was in Calcutta. And during that period, he gave 6 University of Calcutta readership lectures for which the university contributed 2,000 rupees. Now, to understand the importance of this, and I want you to understand the importance of this, and the challenge presented, some background information. First, the development of Fisher's work. He'd begun his research on the theory of statistical estimation, the topic of the 6 lectures, with a paper that he read to the Royal Society on the 21st of November in 1921. The report on the papers at that meeting are over on the right side there from Nature in November of 1921. And you can see here, R.A. Fisher, The Mathematical Foundations of Theoretical Statistics, the most efficient statistics has the least standard deviation, and he goes on and on and on. A special case of the criterion of sufficiency, which requires the sufficient statistic will provide the whole relevant information provided by the sample. Statistics obtained by the method of maximum likelihood are always sufficient statistics. Well, that's wrong, but he didn't know it at the time. And he goes on. It's the 20th century theory of statistics laid out in one paragraph in Nature, and this was the title of this was the subject of his lecture. It's at the same meeting that C.V. Raman gave a talk on the whispering gallery phenomenon, the way sound travels around in a circle in the upper reaches of St. Paul's Cathedral. This paper was published in the next year in the Royal Society's Transactions. Fisher improved it in a Cambridge paper in 1925, and he added to the theory in 1936, 35, and 36. Meanwhile, he was writing his great books. In 1925, he published his book, the textbook, Statistical Methods for Research Workers. In 1930, he published this foundational work on the theory of genetics, genetical theory of natural selection, a field-generating book. In 1935, he published the Design of Experiments, one of the fundamental works of the understanding of experimental science. And when Mahalanobis invited Fisher, he was already world famous, but he had never delivered in any form a treatment of his full theory of estimation, his full theory of statistical theory. The books were on practice, the first text, on genetics and on design, but the theory of the theoretical work was not so set out. There had been a weak attempt to do this with Hotelling in 1930, but it had not worked. The Calcutta lectures were to give him a chance to repair that deficiency, a chance to sum up this great life's work on the theory of statistics all at once in a series of connected lectures for one audience. Now there was another background Fisher, the background fact that you should know about. Remember I said Fisher had given 15 lectures in 10 cities. And here he is to give 6 lectures. There was one thing about Fisher that may not be as well known as it is today as it probably was then. That is that Fisher was not a good lecturer. He was a poor lecturer. And I have a story to tell you about that. I got this from somebody who had been there at the time. He was lecturing in North Carolina in the late 1940s. And the students became so lost and distraught that they picked one of their number to bravely interrupt him in the next lecture. And he did, and asked a question. Professor Fisher, I wonder if you could help our understanding by expressing the idea in different words. And the reply was, young man, I have been lecturing on this topic for some years, and those are the best words. He was not interrupted again. So I don't know what people got out of those 15 lectures, because there seems to be no note of what went on. I can imagine that some people followed parts of them, but they were at least seeing a great man at work or trying to be at work. But the same is not true about the readership lectures at Calcutta. And it's because Mahalanobis was ready. He knew what he was up against. He knew that you don't just get Fisher into the lecture room and have everybody come out with gleaming eyes of understanding. And so for the entire half year or so before the meeting, he had his students read all of Fisher's works, especially the theoretical works, and reread them and explain to each other in seminars. And I'm not sure where this came from, but it could have been from the Indian Statistical Institute in Calcutta at the time, but it could also be from North Carolina. This is what people would do at this point to anticipate Fisher's lectures. They had reprinted, without paying any royalties, his three major papers on estimation. They were bound together. It's a small format. The type's been reduced, and it was distributed to all of the people they could, so that they could read up on this stuff in advance. This particular copy was the copy of Raj Bahadur. So there was preparation. Mahalanobis was ready, and so what did he do? But that wasn't quite enough. He also it turned out that the condition of Calcutta University in giving the money for these lectures was that a manuscript be produced. Now, he didn't tell Fisher that. He did not put all his cards on the table, so to speak. He did not tell him until after the lectures had been given. And Fisher, according to Rudra's biography, tore up some notes when they were sent to him and just said he would not do this. It was not part of the bargain. But Mahalanobis was ready. Two of his best students had taken notes. They'd been studying this stuff all along. And these were K.R. Nair and R.C. Bowes. I mean, this is a level of quality that you don't run into in your average audience. And not only were they were prepared in advance, they'd read everything, and they were really taking careful notes. And they wrote the manuscript. And they did a superior job. As I say, the copy was not to Fisher's acceptance, but that didn't stop Mahalanobis. He submitted it to the syndics at Calcutta, and it was published. In fact, I have a copy. There's a picture of the title page. Well, okay, that's the title page. It was published in September 1938 as by R.A. Fisher, and there's a preface by Fisher dated January, the time the lectures are given. Now, I have to believe that Fisher wrote this for an advertisement of the lectures, so people would get a list of what was going to be covered. I do not think he wrote it as a preface to this book, because he wouldn't have seen it in January. So he wrote, there is a preface, and the printed version is of a very high statistical quality, but it does show a style that is not Fisher's, slight variations. There are a few giveaways. I'll point to one of them. Chapter 6, the method of maximal likelihood. Fisher would never have said maximal likelihood. Maximum likelihood was his term, not maximal. We could say they mean the same thing, not to Fisher. So this is not Fisher, but there's no reason to say that all of the contents aren't Fisher's. It's an extremely valuable publication, and not only because of its rarity, it is not reprinted in the Adelaide version of Fisher's works, although it is listed in the bibliography in those works. I got a copy of this when I bought a set of those reprinted lecture notes online and found this bound in at the end. The previous owner had glued it in there so that he'd have all that stuff together. And I know it exists in a few other places. It's not an absolutely unknown thing, but it's a beautiful piece of work. And in a way, there's some justice to this. Here's Fisher's work not written by Fisher, but there's another case in the different direction. If you read the biographical introduction of Fisher's presidential address at the Congress in the 1938 conference, which was later published with the one volume of his selected papers in 1950, it says it's by Mahalanobis, and it was published in Sankhya in 1938 as by Mahalanobis. But if you read that, you come away absolutely convinced that most of it was not written by Mahalanobis, it was written by Fisher. So he's describing his life, he's describing all sorts of things that there is no way Mahalanobis could have known these things about Fisher. Instead, he would have asked Fisher to write down something about your life. I've got to introduce you as president to this conference. And Fisher had obliged. Mahalanobis had published it. Yeah. Now, the importance of the lectures lay in what they tell us of Fisher's way of thinking in an area that has been much debated. These are a valuable contribution to the history of statistics. He was notorious for stating results without indicating the basis from the result, and even when others have verified what he said rigorously, they puzzled over the origin. And I have one story that gives you an example of this. One example is that the intricate relationship he gave for the multivariate moments called K-statistics. The Irish statistician Geary knew the formulas were all correct, having laboriously figured that out, but he had no idea how Fisher had come upon them. The demonstration for Geary had been so painful that he once pressed Fisher on this question: how did you come up with them? Fisher paused, and then he said, they came to me on the train to Edinburgh. Now, that wouldn't help many people, would it? You can get on that train 100 times, and I would never have come up with those relationships. And the truth is that Fisher was a genius. He had a mind that could do things, and there are times when he could have re-entered that, he probably could have re-entered that frame of mind and recreated the thinking that he'd gone through to get to it, but that would have been a huge mental effort, and he didn't want to do it. And he wasn't going to do it. And the same was true with a lot of his statistics. And so what can we learn from this? Well, in these particular, one of the things that shows up here and in nowhere in his earlier works is how he derived this from using differential geometry, from a geometry of model spaces. Admittedly in a simple case of a parameterized multinomial distribution, but there are things that he does here that I found was in other of his unpublished work. This is the only place that you can get a published explanation of that, and it's through the hands of these brilliant students and these lectures that Mahalanobis had arranged. Now, Fisher visited ISI 8 times, and his relationship went through different phases. Here we've seen this. Dear Professor Mahalanobis in 1929. The professor gets slowly dropped when they had the near break of relationship. Then it returns, and then at the end they're the best of friends. And they were. Fisher did not just come here because he was being treated very well and found people that were understanding and thought he was a great man, which most people are accepting of that kind of a judgment. but he liked Mahalanobis. He came for long periods of time, and he enjoyed the stays. Now, I have offered you 3 examples here. On the work of a major and accomplished figure, and it shows how an already mature statistical scientist could work, and gives a clue as to much of his later work, much later work of his, the second 5-year economic plan for Nehru. What is that? Well, I found a quotation from I think I've got this on another slide in a minute, but that's okay. Mahalanobis gave a lecture on All India Radio in 1955, and one of the sentences stood out to me. For a single factor, the production of steel probably has the highest correlation with national income in different countries. Now, that is an echo of the causal reasoning that was behind the meteorological paper. I mean, we see Mahalanobis 1923 resurfacing in one of the largest and most complicated planning exercises of the century. It's a very different subject, but the thinking and the seeds had been, and everything that he did was remembered. The second, well, this was the one that was the second was the trouble with Fisher. And I claim that it really was the beginning of D squared, which that's not a new claim, we'll see that. But I went 3 weeks ago, I was in London, and I went to the archives, the Pearson archives, and they still have the original submissions, the original copies. This is what the front page of the part of it that was actually published looks like now, heavily marked up. That's Pearson's handwriting in the upper left. Some of this, the rest of this is a lot by Morant. That's the first page, not much change there. He crosses out a bunch of things, but you get about 3 or 4 pages into it, and it's crossed out. Oh, and here's the data. We'll publish all of that. It was a real hatchet job done on that one. And you can find that it's a fairly long paper in Biometrica because it had a lot of data in it. That was published in the other one, though, the one that really had the development of D squared, is still in the archives there too. Now, a version of it was published, as I said, and I did not try to compare the manuscript with the published version, but if you really wanted to do a full historical study of the development of Mahalanobis distance, you would have to look at the archives in London as well as the published works. Third, the Congress. Well, this was really a Congress. It was not, they called it a conference, but it was a Congress. And it was a global Congress. It was a bold statement to the world that there are great developments in India, that the map was being changed. He had brought a new institute into existence. He had the interest of the state involved. He had got people from all over, cities, 10 cities were involved. And his bringing Fisher in to highlight the star statistician of the world, it did 2 things. It paraded the world's most famous statistician before the new cohort developing in India, including some brilliant students, and it brought India to the attention of the world stage. Now, Mahalanobis was an unusually good statistician. I've come to believe that by reading a number of his works. He was an absolutely remarkable developer of institutions. And in the category of the 20th century, only Karl Pearson and Jerzy Neyman can be considered to be at this level. And neither of them succeeded on the same scale or with so many challenges.